Hello, dear friends. Welcome to a new video on this channel. Today, I'm excited to share with you the captivating story of Daphne Bridgerton and Simon Basset, the Duke of Hastings. It's important to note that what I'm about to narrate is based on the first book of the Bridgerton Saga, titled The Duke and I, written by author Julia Quinn. So, without further ado, let's begin. The ninth Duke of Hastings, an unpleasant and overbearing man, eagerly awaited the birth of his only son and heir. He was obsessed with continuing the family line and, after several miscarriages and against medical advice, his wife decided to carry the child to term, convinced that it was her duty to produce an heir. But at the very moment Simon Basset came into the world, she died. The little boy grew up in a lonely environment, under the care of the family servants, and with minimal interest from his father. His father's contempt for his son grew when he discovered that Simon could neither speak nor read at the age of 4. And when the man tried to force words out of him, he could only make him stammer. Furious, the man declared that his son was a disgrace to his family and claimed that they were cursed. When Simon turned 11, he gathered his courage and confronted his father, who lived far away in London. He was taken to his father's house, where the shocked servants, who thought he was dead, greeted him with utter horror. There he stood before his father and, with difficulty, said, "I am your son," but the Duke ordered him to leave, humiliating him utterly. This act pushed the boy to his limit, and from that moment on, he vowed to become everything his father did not want him to be. 26th April, 1813. Lady Whistledown's scandalous society magazine had only recently begun circulating in London and was already making headlines. The woman in question, whose real identity was unknown, spoke of the most prominent families of London society. The latest of her journals contained the news that Simon Basset, now the Duke of Hastings, had returned from abroad. This would undoubtedly have attracted the attention of Violet, who for the first time had one of her daughters on the marriage market. But instead, the woman had hoped to escape the bachelor, who had a reputation for womanizing and debauchery. Daphne remembered hearing her older brother Anthony talk about Simon, as they had both attended the same school, and mentioned him to her mother, although she immediately made it clear to her mother that she was not interested in him, as she hoped to marry for love. Meanwhile, at a gentleman's club, Simon was playing cards with Anthony, to whom he told of his contempt for his new title, and how absurd it was to feel obliged to carry on the legacy of a father who had done nothing but despise him. Anthony then reminded him that he had promised to attend Lady Danbury's next ball, and that the mothers of London would seek him out, seeing him as a desirable bachelor, whether Simon wished to marry or not. Pleased with the displeasure he had caused, he invited his friend to dinner at his house, assuring him that he would like his younger sister. When Daphne arrived on the day of Lady Danbury's ball, she found herself hiding from a persistent suitor, a man called Nigel Burbrook, whose proposal she had already turned down once. Simon, meanwhile, reflected on his personal history as he made his way to the dance. Simon felt that Lady Danbury's ball was pointless for someone who did not wish to marry, but decided to attend because of Lady Danbury's kindness in looking after him when he was a child. For this reason, he decided to come to greet her and leave as soon as possible, but his plans did not turn out as he had hoped. He found himself in an unpleasant situation, a man and a woman arguing in the dark. Suddenly, he heard a scream and decided to intervene, but he found that the woman had beaten the mystery man unconscious. Simon laughed helplessly, attracting the attention of the woman, who, turning to look at him, took the wind out of his sails. The girl, obviously annoyed, demanded to know his name, but Simon simply replied that he was a would-be rescuer. Daphne asked him to help her get the man out, despite the fact that he had tried to make a pass at her a few minutes earlier. Impressed by her compassion and composure, Simon imagined himself kissing Daphne on the neck, but she noticed his distraction and mocked him. But when Nigel sobbingly mentioned the girl's name, Simon was horrified to realize that he had been flirting with his best friend's sister. And when Daphne realized who he was, the feeling was mutual, but she assured him that she had no romantic interest in him because of his scandalous reputation. This unnerved Simon, who nearly stammered. Daphne, oblivious, began to explain that she had learned of his reputation from Lady Whistledown, who had called him a rake in her gossip sheet. He then approached her, placed a finger on her chin, and tried to seduce her, pleased to see the emotion on her face. But after a few minutes of intimidation, Daphne burst out laughing, explaining that she was well acquainted with such games. The girl's amused attitude made her more attractive in Simon's eyes, although he reminded himself that he had to save his reputation and overcome his attraction to her, if only for the sake of self-control. They debated how best to deal with the unconscious Nigel. Although her know-it-all attitude, she claimed to have a vast knowledge of men because of her brothers, led to an argument, so they finally decided to leave Nigel where he was and leave the place. To Simon's dismay, their return to the ballroom attracted the attention of all the young single women present, although he could only wonder where Daphne was. Anthony then introduced him to his brothers, although it was Colin who used his cunning and wit to get their attention. The boys discussed whether they should save Daphne from Violet's clutches, although they were too intimidated by their mother to do so they suggested that Simon should help the girl. He then admitted that he had, in fact, already met her. Simon noticed a change in the atmosphere between the brothers, who were now wary and protective, especially Anthony. The boy tried to smooth things over by claiming that they had bumped into each other in the corridor, which disappointed Colin, who thought Simon's reputation was exaggerated. But he was eventually persuaded to go over and talk to Daphne. Not entirely convinced, Simon approached Daphne, who was arguing with her mother for not telling her that she had already met the aforementioned. As soon as he arrived, he noticed Violet giving them a look that hinted at nothing more than a marriage plan between the two of them. And as Lady Featherington seemed to be approaching Simon again, he decided to escape by asking Daphne to dance with him. On the dance floor, they both complained about how boring the dance was, and Daphne laughed when Simon started talking about the harassment she received from single women and their mothers, and she complained about how difficult it was to find a man to marry. Simon then suggested that she could get married to escape social pressure, and she boldly and amusingly asked him if his comment was a proposal, which he clearly took as a joke. She began to tell him about the unwelcome advances she had received from older men, and he confessed that he did not care about his family's legacy at all, and therefore had no plans to marry. She admitted that she wanted a family of her own, as she had loved growing up with her brothers and sisters. This moved Simon, who became increasingly attracted to her, but reminded himself that he had to leave her untouched for another man, as he could not offer her marriage or a socially acceptable relationship. He then told her that he admired her confidence. It was then that the boy had a revelation. They could pretend to be a couple, or at least in a courtship, so that they could have a break from their social obligations. He argued that Daphne's unavailability would make her look more intriguing to the men she was really interested in, and at the same time appease her mother's pressure. As for him, he would be free of society's mothers by showing interest in her, and after some thought, Daphne agreed. The next day, Simon turned up at the Bridgertons at Daphne's request, who insisted that a formal visit would add to the rumors of their courtship. But when he arrived, he found the girl surrounded by a crowd of admiring men. The other men, however, were dispatched by Violet, who cleared the way for Simon to reach his daughter. Once alone, they bantered about the matriarch's effectiveness in the affair and Anthony's bad humor at her false courtship. So Daphne decided it was best to tell him the truth to avoid damaging their friendship. She then thanked him for the tulips he had brought her, although he admitted that they were not really for her, but for Violet. As they talk, trying to ignore the obvious connection between them, they are interrupted by Violet, who cries with emotion as she receives the flowers, having not received such a gesture since her father's death. This made Daphne think that she would be a fool not to fall in love with Simon. She then decides to go and look for a vase, but just then an angry Anthony arrives who, faced with his mother's intimidating authority, decides to take Simon into his office, where he demands to know Simon's intentions towards his younger sister. Simon, irritated by his friend's tone, accused him of underestimating Daphne's intelligence and made it clear that he was no longer the libertine, womanizing man he had been in his 20s. But this does not bother Anthony, who is actually worried about Daphne falling in love with his friend, knowing that he has no desire to marry or start a family. They are then interrupted by the girl who, having realized that they are both still alive, decides to tell her brother all about the plan. Predictably, Anthony reacts badly, thinking they must be mad. He then threatened to kill Simon, declaring that their friendship was over, and kicked him out of his house despite Daphne's claims that the plan had brought her new suitors. Anthony eventually agreed, seeing his sister's desire to marry, but not before threatening Simon with death if Daphne's reputation was threatened or if the two were ever left alone. That evening, at the family dinner, Simon was surprised to find the company of such a large family agreeable to an only child, and, unable to refuse, accepted Lady Bridgerton's invitation to go boating. Watching the scene, Daphne thought it would undoubtedly devastate her mother to have to fake her breakup with Simon, thinking that even she would be a fool to leave him in a real situation. Soon after, Simon found himself on the most boisterous family outing he'd ever experienced, but he didn't mind at all. He'd accepted the invitation not out of politeness or obligation, but out of pure joy. On the boat, Simon and Daphne chatted about this, and although he could do nothing but admire her beauty, and at one point even leaned over to kiss her, he was interrupted by Anthony, who suspiciously led her away from the place. Later, on returning home, Daphne decided to ask Anthony why Simon didn't want to get married. This aroused her brother's suspicions, although she assured him that she had no desire to marry Simon and that he would never seduce her. Her brother, still suspicious, explained that Simon had always been reluctant to marry and that this was no mere whim, and he assured her that Simon, for all his good qualities, was not for her. But Daphne could not help thinking that perhaps her brother was wrong. Days later, Daphne attended a ball where she waited anxiously to see Simon in the crowd, despite Anthony's insistence that she give him space to find a suitor interested in marriage. But what her brother didn't know was that it was too late, because Daphne had already fallen in love. And somehow, she hoped that he would feel the same way, since he tended to act differently in her company. Simon arrived on the scene shortly afterwards. Daphne took the opportunity to complain that he had been missing for the last few days, a situation that even Lady Whistledown had commented on in her magazine, and which was jeopardizing their false courtship, but their discussion was interrupted when they were intercepted by the Duke of Middlethorpe, who claimed to be a friend of Simon's late father, and offered Simon a pile of letters that the man had left with him. The boy, annoyed, refused to accept them, and instead ordered them to be burned, as he did not want them. However, the man asked Daphne to keep the letters for herself, and the girl reluctantly agreed. Confused by Simon's attitude, she decided to ask him why it bothered her so much to hear about her father, and Simon, struggling for words, simply replied that he found the subject difficult. They decided to go for a walk in the garden. Daphne, being quite perceptive, had already noticed the connection between them. The tension between their bodies drew them together, and she refused to let the opportunity pass as she led the way into the garden. Declaring to himself that kissing Daphne was a matter of self-preservation because he'd die if he didn't, Simon leaned in and kissed her passionately, noting with satisfaction that she returned the kiss. He slid his hands down her body, pressing her against his, and pulled her dress down to reveal her cleavage. But this moment of heated passion was interrupted by a third party, who they soon discovered was none other than Anthony. Anthony, enraged, attacked Simon, shouting something about his sister's dignity. Daphne, who tried in vain to intervene, was punched and pushed into a hedge in the garden. Simon then told Anthony that he would go to Europe rather than marry Daphne, but Anthony rejected this idea by shouting for a duel to the death, which Simon accepted, but not before warning him that he would rather die than be shot. Daphne, who watched without saying anything, was hurt. Simon would rather run away and die than marry her. Why was he so indifferent to her? What was the reason he had decided to kiss her? Simon, who had been absorbed in the fight, decided to look at her at that moment, and seeing the expression on her face, declared, "If I could be anyone, it would be you. But to marry me would destroy you. I could never give you what you want. You would die a little every day, and it would kill me to see it." And they left. Back at home, Daphne paces the room, trying to devise a plan to prevent the duel and convince Simon to marry her before her mother returns from the ball. There she meets Colin, who suggests that someone saw her leave the ball in Simon's company for the garden. She tells him everything that has happened and begs him to help her stop the duel and save Simon's life. Colin, unsure of his decision, decides to reveal the location of the duel to his sister so that she can get there before Anthony makes a mistake and tells her that he will be accompanied by Benedict. Desperate, Daphne made her way to the site of the duel, where she found her brother, gun in hand, about to begin. He was naturally furious to see her and asked her what she was thinking, but after several minutes of pleading from the girl, it was Benedict who agreed to let her speak to Simon. Daphne then turned to the boy and tried to reason with him, but when she saw that he was closed to the possibility of listening to her, she decided to give him a punch, which no doubt stunned him. She then took the opportunity to make her voice heard and begged him to marry her. He explained that he had to save her reputation, as there were rumors of their meeting, which, if spread, could ruin the possibility of a marriage and her being part of society. "Save me," she begged in a whisper. Simon was clear about his position and his decision never to start a family, but he didn't think the Bridgertons would understand. They had been part of a large and loving family. They had never experienced rejection from anyone, let alone a father, so he decided it was not worth trying to explain what was going through his mind. On the other hand, he didn't want to be the cause of Daphne's unhappiness. He wanted her, and he certainly hadn't lied when he told her that if he wanted to marry her, he would. But at the time, he hadn't thought it could happen. Now, however, he felt unable to say no to her. He agreed to marry her, but interrupted her exclamations of joy by telling her to listen to what he had to say before deciding if she really wanted to commit to him. "I can't have children," he said without a second thought. "You have to understand that." Daphne looked at him, not knowing what to say. She seemed distraught and now hesitant. She had certainly made it clear on more than one occasion how much she wanted to be a mother and start a family, so it seemed almost impossible to say goodbye to the possibility. But to Simon's, and probably her own, surprise, Daphne finally agreed and, without waiting much longer, told her brother that she would marry Simon. Soon, all of London learns of the impending but unsurprising wedding of the Duke of Hastings and Daphne, which everyone seems to be celebrating, everyone except the bride and groom. Daphne, alone in her room, tries to reflect on what has happened, consoling herself with the thought that perhaps Simon thinks he is sterile and is probably wrong. Preparations for the wedding then begin, and the date is set for a week from now, during which time Simon fails to appear. However, he turns up at the Bridgerton house 2 days early with a ring for Daphne. Daphne excitedly asks him if it is the family jewelry, and he, somewhat annoyed by the question, replies that it is not, explaining that he has actually chosen it, especially for her. Later that day, Daphne found herself in her room having an awkward conversation with her mother. Her mother is trying rather awkwardly to explain what is going to happen on the night of her wedding, but without revealing anything that might embarrass her, so she ends up bringing nothing useful to the conversation, which annoys Daphne, who anxiously tries to press her mother for more information. She then told her that indulging Simon's desires on a regular basis would lead to children, just as she reluctantly admitted that people used to have sex for pleasure. Daphne then asks him if it is like the pleasure of kissing, which inevitably exposes her to her mother, who is outraged and decides to run away. Alone, Daphne begins to wonder if Simon will be able to consummate their marriage. The next day, Daphne and Simon are married in a beautiful ceremony, where they solemnly recite their vows. Gregory has a sneezing fit which causes laughter among those present, and the bride and groom kiss so passionately that soon all of London begins to say that the new Duke and Duchess of Hastings are the happiest and most devoted couple to marry for decades. After the wedding, Simon and Daphne set off for their new home, Cliveden Castle. Simon had noticed that his now wife was very nervous, so he decided it would be best to spend the night at an inn, and it was becoming increasingly difficult not to want her, so it would be best to keep her away from him most of the time. When she arrived, she found herself arguing with the receptionist, who had told her that he only had one room. Daphne thought that maybe he didn't want to share a room with her because of what she had already suspected, but once they were in the room, she told him that she didn't care if they had to consummate their marriage there, since he had told her that they wouldn't do it until they got to the castle. The boy was speechless, not knowing what to say to her, which upset her, so she apologized for not taking her helplessness into account. At that moment, Simon was stunned, unable to say anything. Powerlessness? Where did the woman get the idea that he was impotent? She then explained that she thought he was impotent because his mother had told him that sex was for procreation, and since he had told her that they couldn't have children, she just put it together. Simon realized that Daphne was obviously ignorant about everything to do with sex, which made him laugh in a way, so he asked her not to explain anymore, as he couldn't help laughing in her face. He approached her and took one of her hands in his. "I assure you," he said, running his tongue along a finger, "that I am perfectly capable of satisfying you in bed." Suddenly, Daphne found it hard to breathe. "And how long has it been so hot in this room? I don't quite know what you mean." He pulled her close to his body. "You'll find out," he whispered, and they consummated their marriage. The next few days were spent in bed, snuggled up together, until Daphne decided to take on the responsibilities of mistress of the house. Curious, Daphne decides to invite the housekeeper, Mrs. Coulson, to tea to get to know her better. She then tells her about the devotion she felt for her late mistress, Simon's mother, and the fertility problems she had experienced, explaining that they were probably due to the lack of a strong and healthy seed. A womb will not grow without a strong and healthy seed, and this was what had happened on Simon's father's side. He also told him about Simon's troubled relationship with his father, who believed the boy was defective because of his childhood speech problems. Later that day, Daphne and Simon share a bed again, and although she enjoys the moment immensely, she can't help but think about her conversation with the housekeeper and wonder how hard it would be for Simon to have any conversation at all. Then, when Simon interrupts before she arrives, Daphne has a revelation, remembering the strange phrase she heard minutes before. Simon, already asleep, is awakened by a furious Daphne, who claims that he has taken advantage of her ignorance about sex and lied to her. She felt betrayed by him, that he had taken advantage of her stupidity and made her believe that she couldn't have children, when in fact she didn't want to. He, not knowing how much she might know about it, reminded her of what he had warned her the day he stopped the duel, that he would never have children, and that it was not something he was willing to discuss. She then told him that if it was true that he couldn't have children, then it didn't matter where his sperm ended up. Simon felt anger rising inside him. He tried to explain his relationship with him to Daphne, but she cut him off, telling him that she already knew the story, that she knew that his mother didn't like him, that she thought he was stupid, that she even knew he stuttered. This took him by surprise, but he continued to try to explain. He told her that the only thing his father cared about was his blood and his title, and so when he was born and showed himself to be imperfect, his father did nothing but tell everyone that his only heir was dead. For that reason, he had decided never to have children, for nothing would hurt his father more than losing the title of Hastings, so that was exactly what he would do. The next day, Daphne went to see Simon to try and talk to him, but he seemed reluctant to engage. Several drinks and fights later, Simon returned drunk, and in a desperate attempt to win Daphne back, tried to explain his reasons for opposing his father, but she kept insisting that he was wrong. After a few minutes, Daphne decided that there was no point in arguing any further and agreed to let Simon stay the night. An hour later, she woke up. She didn't remember falling asleep, but at the time, she thought it best to go and leave him alone. She didn't want him to wake up and think she had forgiven him. But most of all, she didn't want him to think that meant she agreed with his idea of not starting a family. She tried to get up, but he pulled her to his body, grunting a refusal. As he did so, Daphne felt his excitement and realized that she could do whatever she wanted to him. She began to seduce him, and he asked for more of her, and she gave it to him, and when he tried to stop, his desire prevented him, and Daphne embraced him, refusing to waste the opportunity. It was now or never. He realized too late what she had done, and that it had all been on purpose. Annoyed, he left the place, but not before asking her, in between several stammers, how she had been able to do it. 10 hours later, Daphne received a message from Simon saying that he had left town and to let her know if his attempts at conception had borne fruit. Daphne was heartbroken to think that her love would be enough to convince Simon to start a family, so, with nothing else to do, she decided to return to London. Once there, she decided to move into Simon's family home, Hastings House. The absence of her period began to make Daphne suspect she was pregnant, so she decided to write a letter to her husband telling him the news. But before the letter could be posted, Anthony arrived and demanded to know where her husband was. Furious, Daphne ordered him to stay out of her affairs and threatened never to speak to him again, and to calm the situation a little, he agreed to travel to Simon himself to deliver the letter, but not before making her promise not to read it or kill her husband. After several days of traveling, Anthony was reunited with Simon. It had been 2 months since he had heard from his wife, and when he saw the letter in his brother-in-law's hand, he knew with certainty the reason for his visit. He missed his wife, of course he did, and he loved her, but he was still angry with her, though strangely not for the reasons he had thought before. Anthony then asked him what the real reason for their separation was, since it was clear that they both loved each other. Simon, of course, did not answer the question, but decided it was time to return to London, so he took his carriage and headed for the capital. When he arrives, he finds that Daphne is not at the Bridgerton house, not even in her own house. The elderly domo informs him that she has gone for a ride. Suddenly, Simon is worried. What on earth was going through his wife's mind? How could she think of going riding in her present state? It was too risky. In a panic, he sets off in search of her, taking a horse himself. He soon finds her riding at full speed, but when she notices him, he loses control and falls to the ground. Simon approaches her, and after checking that she is all right, berates her for not thinking of her own safety and that of her son. She looks at him in disbelief and angrily asks him why he cares when he never wanted to have the child. Simon agreed that it was true, but now that he knew it was coming, he didn't want to kill him. It was then that Daphne, despite her desires and frustrations, confessed to him that she was not pregnant. At first he thought she had lied to him, but she quickly made it clear that she had thought she was, but she wasn't. Simon felt something like disappointment, though he wanted to believe it wasn't so. Daphne burst into tears, devastated that she had not been able to conceive a baby. He tried to comfort her, telling her to forgive him and reassuring her that he had not left because of her or what he had done, although it had clearly upset him, but because he was upset with himself for losing control. They then had a talk about her father, and Daphne gave him a speech about how she needed to get over her hatred of him and her desire for revenge, as all she was getting out of it was that he continued to dictate her life. She asked him if he had ever thought about whether he really wanted a family. "If I give him a grandchild, he wins," Simon whispered. "No. If you have a child, you win," Daphne said. "We all win." Simon said nothing, but Daphne could see that he was trembling. If you don't want children because you don't want them, that's one thing. But if you deny yourself the joy of fatherhood for the sake of a dead man, you're a coward. And when he told her that all he wanted now was to be happy, she responded by saying, "You will be." Back at the house, the couple met Anthony, Benedict, and Colin, who angrily demanded to know what was going on and threatened to stay in the house until they were sure of Simon's feelings for his sister. Simon then pulled Daphne away, assuring her that he loved her more than ever, and that his love was so strong that it had changed his mind about marriage and even the idea of starting a family. Daphne then approached her brothers to kick them out, but was interrupted by her mother, who pulled Colin's ear and scolded them for interfering in her sister's marriage. That night, Simon and Daphne made love, and now, with her full consent, they decided to get pregnant. But one doubt haunted Simon. What if their child was born like him? What if he had trouble speaking? Daphne told him that she would have him, who she was sure would love and support him as much as she did. He nods, now more sure of himself and his decision. It is then that Daphne remembers something, and that is that she has been keeping the letters from Simon's father all this time. She then tells the boy about this, but to her surprise, he doesn't seem concerned or interested, and even tells her that all he wants to do now is look after her, his marriage and learning how to be a father. 4 years later, on 15th of December, 1817. After 3 girls, Daphne had finally given birth to a boy. Ironically, he was thought to be just what Simon had been waiting for, an heir to his title. His other 3 daughters, Amelia, Belinda, and Caroline, had been named in alphabetical order, as was the Bridgerton family custom, and now the newborn was to be called David. 16 years later, Daphne, now 41, suspected she was pregnant. While she was checking her calendar and calculating the date of her last period, Simon walked into the room and surprised her. He then began to complain about his daughters and how they were of marriageable age. Daphne tried to convince herself that she wasn't pregnant. Maybe it was just the menopause. She was old enough for that anyway, wasn't she? But when she threw up, she realized that she was indeed pregnant. She definitely couldn't tell Simon, at least not yet. She wasn't ready for that. Luckily for them, Colin and Penelope arrived on the scene. The couple had come to their home seeking Simon's help as their young son Georgie was having difficulty speaking, but it only took one look from Penelope to realize the news about her sister-in-law. Meanwhile, the aforementioned man had been attending to a problem on one of his farms, unaware of what was going on. When he returned home, he was told that Daphne was ill, but when he saw her vomiting for no apparent reason, he immediately realized that the supposed illness was nothing more than an unexpected pregnancy. Daphne then told him about the visit from Colin and Penelope, who had advised her to give her son lots of love without knowing what else to say. Simon, who had listened attentively, had nothing useful to say either. So he decided to look for his father's letters. They hoped to find something useful, though neither knew exactly what. Eventually, Daphne offered to read them, but to no one's surprise, she found nothing more than mere instructions left by Simon's father for the proper administration of the Hastings estates and properties. For a moment, Daphne thought she would see her husband disappointed, but he seemed completely indifferent, and even then she decided that she would finally burn the letters. But this time not out of hatred, spite, or revenge, but because she no longer cared about them or her father. All he wanted now was to devote himself to his wife, his 3 eldest children, and the one on the way. And he was certain that the advice he would give to Colin and Penelope at that moment would be to look after little Georgie with love, for that was all the child would need to thrive. Daphne, touched, assured him that he would be a good father to the baby, as he had always been. Remember, if you enjoyed this type of content, the best way to support me is by leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you next time.